Welcome to the Like Iron Research Review, a subsection of the Like Iron podcast where we pick an academic article and discuss it. If you enjoy nerding out about strength, fitness, and performance, this is the podcast for you. Remember, research is ever-changing, and our views and opinions will change as well. None of the information in this show should be seen as medical advice, and you should always talk to your medical provider before starting a fitness regimen. Let's get into the cast, Like Iron.
Come paint my face, come take my hand.
Hey guys, Shannon here. I just want to give you a quick heads up and warning that the following audio in this podcast may not be as clear and concise as the audio in past podcasts. As Jackson, Wes, and I no longer live in the same city, we are recording them online over Skype and with differing levels of mic quality. So until I learn to clear everything up post-production or we get better setups, please bear with us. The content is still awesome, still great, and the audio I don't think is that bad, but I just wanted to give you a warning that tell you the reason that it's not as great as before. Please enjoy the show. Tell me what you think. If you have any tips on audio editing, please let me know. Hello and welcome to the Three Little Pigs podcast. This is our Three Little Pigs research review. My name's Shannon.
I'm Wes.
And today we have a paper, again by John Kiely. I think we reviewed the John Kiely paper last week or last episode or 2 episodes ago. This one is entitled Periodization Paradigms in the 21st Century, Evidence-Led or Tradition-Driven, published in the International Journal of Sports Physiology and Performance, again, authored by John Kiely. It is another kind of like current opinion paper, which, as we discussed a couple weeks ago, isn't actually doing any systematic review of the literature or any actual research. Do you have anything else to say about that?
Aren't we reviewing the periodization theory confronting an inconvenient truth?
Oh, shit. Okay. It's the same thing.
It's still by Kiely, though.
Yeah, okay.
So it's
I
really
have both of them
similar.
up. I just, okay.
Yeah, it's really similar.
I got confused.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add other than, it is a current opinion paper. So it's basically, an interpretation of the evidence at large, but they're not doing an actual study. They're just reviewing the literature and coming to a conclusion, and potentially challenging some previous paradigms.
Mm-hmm. Again, for anybody confused there, I was wrong. The paper is Periodization Theory, Confronting an Inconvenient Truth, also by John Kiely. It's kind of I think a more recent one. He published the other one in 2012. This one's, they talk about the exact same topic, so they're both a good read. So basically this paper is kind of challenging current or classical periodization theory almost. So Wes, what is periodization? I think we should start by defining that for our listeners.
Yeah, in general, I think the way it's been taught for a very long time is it's just an organized long-term approach to training variables. So it's like, how do you structure your training in the long run to get the quote unquote, best outcomes? Mm-hmm. Anything you want to add to that or
no? Yeah, just definition? Some structured training program that it generally follows a similar trajectory. So it goes from usually the classical periodization goes from high volume to low volume, low intensity to high intensity, and follows these discrete blocks, right? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that, there are different periodization models. And so you see some that are linear, like the one you talked about, some that are undulating, like the one that you talked about. I think in general, they're not all mutually exclusive, and so you can have different periodization models within each other. But yeah, I think in general, conceptually, it's organization of training variables over time, and programming makes up those, I guess blocks or whatever throughout the periodization model.
Mm-hmm. So to give a background of periodization, basically it's as this paper says as well, is a lot of it's based on kind of like stress theory and how that came about in the 30s or 40s. And a lot of it was proposed by a guy named Hans Selye, which he proposed what's called the general adaptation syndrome, which basically means that like there's a general response to stress, and that response to stress, in this case training stress, follows this specific triphasic response. So there's an alarm, there's response, and then there's exhaustion, right? Would you agree with that little brief synopsis? Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, the only thing that I would add is it was rather than a specific, it was a non-specific trajectory. And so that's why it was kind of coined like general adaptation. So like no matter what the stress was, it was kind of like this non-specific trajectory.
Well, non-specific but it followed this specific, like,
yeah. Okay.
There's always this response and this, like,
yes. Okay.
these steps of response.
Yeah, I agree.
So what are the flaws with that? Because that was like proposed by Hans Selye in like, I think, the 30s. So we've come a long way, and we still kind of like cite Hans Selye in the research and in basic textbooks on periodization.
Yeah, I think one of the problems is, first of all, it basically takes into consideration the physical, I guess, elements of stress. And so it's like he applied some sort of physical stress to rodents, and they followed that triphasic response that you were mentioning. That was like an alarm, then a resistance, and then some sort of like adaptation. But it followed that's a non-specific trajectory. And one of the issues, I think, is that it really only took into consideration the physical aspects, and it didn't necessarily take into consideration some of the other aspects that go into stress, like the psychological aspects, the emotional aspects, just to name a few.
Yeah. I think he defined it as like culmination of all like biological processes with stress. So, and in this paper, there's a quote from him saying that like the stress response is kind of a purely physiological and medical phenomenon, is how he imagined it. When we all know there's other components like the psychological one.
Yeah.
But I think the bigger problem with it is his vision of it is that it's like a species-wide phenomenon, and it happens like the same for everybody in similar manners. When kind of more recent work has showed us that the stress response varies not just by individual, but by like this situation and the specificity of the stimulus, as you said.
Yeah, I agree. And then I think another thing that was really interesting is how it went from rodent models, and now it's been applied and kind of been like the prevailing theory in the coaching world too. Even in this paper, it says that so you never consider the application of this to sporting domains, but yet we still use this as like the thing. You know what I mean? Like everyone says like, oh, we're always talking about general adaptation syndrome. But fail to consider the other non-physical things that influence stress.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Do you want to talk about any of like the confusion or controversy behind this as it's applied to sport?
Yeah. So when it's applied to sport, it's basically telling us that like we can predict. I think the whole premise is the problem is it's saying we can predict the stress response of an individual, right? And so periodization set up in a way that goes from point A to point B in very discrete, pre-structured, like sometimes like years in advance for some people, in a like manner from this top-down system. But that's again following the Hans Selye kind of model. Even though like the stress research world has kind of moved on from that model, it seems like we're stuck in that. So I think the main problem is that like we're really bad at predicting, so we should have ways to accommodate that in our programming.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it becomes really challenging, I would say even in practice, to have an athlete comply and really actually see progress on a structured program that is not willing to change based on how well they, I guess, progress from that given program. And so I think something that needs to be taken into consideration is it's useful to have a framework, but it's also, I think, responsible to monitor that athlete and change the programming if need be due to other life factors outside of just the training. Because shit happens in life, and that can affect the allostatic load. Should we talk about allostasis and how they define it here, and potentially how this is more along the lines of the current literature on the total accumulation of stress?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, why don't you go ahead and hit on that?
Okay, cool. So I think that one thing that Kiely brings up is the concept of allostasis, and he's basically discussing how there are more than just the physical aspects that go into stress. And so he goes on to discuss things like immunological things, neurobiological things, psycho-emotional aspects that all influence stress, which then therefore all impact the amount of stress that a specimen can basically recover and adapt from. And this allostatic load is basically the accumulation of all those stressors rather than just the physical stress from programming, and how monitoring and managing this load can be incredibly useful in athletes' performance and long-term success.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just saw this little quote on it. I thought kind of was pretty good. And basically, it says, allostasis is not a specific set of tightly controlled, like, homeostatic conditions that must be defended, but a set of collaborative processes that strategically deploy resources to preserve functionality in an unpredictable and dynamically changing environment. So I think that right there at the end is key, that it's a dynamically changing environment. So if we set up this system or this program that's just so predicated on this plan that takes us from point A to point B, and we start at the end and work our way back. That doesn't, like we said earlier, doesn't take into account the dynamics of the person and how their response to the stress changes over time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a really good point that you made there was, we are a moving target over time, and so you're not just going to be able to, like, linearly predict, your response to something. That would be super nice if we could, but that's not how it happens. And so it's like at one point in time, one snapshot in your life, a certain amount of stress, may be appropriate, but at a different point in life, there may be more stressors involved, or you might need, more physical stress to adapt from something, or you might need less because the amount of, psycho-emotional and all these other stresses are very, very high. And so you need to do a good job of monitoring your progress and the life stresses collaboratively, not just the physical aspects, but, in general, I would say most things are multifactorial. There's going to be a lot of things that influence how much, you can train and recover from and subsequently adapt to at a given snapshot. And then doing your best to monitor those things over time is very useful, but realizing that situations change and you change as an organism is also incredibly useful.
Yeah. So we've talked about kind of the problem with the traditional theory and the traditional periodization system, that it's predicated on our ability to predict all that stuff. It doesn't take into account a changing environment. So we talk about the problem. Let's talk about the solution. So what do you think we could do to improve our planning for athletes? We can talk about powerlifting specifically, since that's who we predominantly train. But yeah, how do we improve this system? What do we do?
So I think improvements for powerlifting would be to shift the paradigm from pure periodization, like top-down approach, to, I would say, almost a mixture of a framework but a bottom-up approach. And so you can have this general framework, like an outline of what you want, because you still need to have some sort of a plan. It can't just be fly by the seat of your pants all the time. Like, you need to have some sort of plan. But I think that plan needs to be willing to change and auto-regulated based on the stressors involved in your life and also how you're responding to the given physical stimulus in the gym. And so I think things that you can do, and this kind of goes back to our philosophy on training that you guys have heard many times before in previous podcasts, is individualization of training program. You know, I think it's useful to use previous experience from that given athlete to make reasonable predictions for future outcomes. But I think that what's really responsible again is to, you know, I would say be willing to change the program if need be, if the athlete isn't responding well, isn't complying. Um, I would say that in general. What do you have to add to that, Shane?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. But I would say, yeah, having some sort of being able to track data and track response based on specific, stimulus and stuff. So basically just having some kind of like feedback process in your programming, or you're working with the athlete where you're keeping track of how they're responding to something and then changing that as you go if need be. So again, as you said, have a plan and plan out maybe from top down this framework, like you said, and then build up from there or change week to week as need be. That's where auto-regulation comes really in handy too. Kind of gives us some flexibility to take advantage of that ever-changing environment. Having little things like just tracking like volume and tracking estimated 1 rep max and stuff, so we can kind of see what's happening with the variables of the program. And then also just developing a relationship with the athlete. Like you need feedback. That's why I think periodization and sometimes really popular. It kind of gives us, or like classical periodization. I'm not saying periodization is bad in any way. It's very good. But like a classical plan, you just give it to an athlete and they go with it. It's almost like laziness. Like they don't want to develop a relationship and build from there. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
That communication is key. Otherwise, you have nothing to go on.
Yeah, I think to add on to that is also that, initial athlete buy-in that we've talked about in the past, and developing a trusting relationship with your athlete. But that trusting relationship will also allow them to open up to you and discuss the things that, maybe more sensitive to them that is occurring in their life. By no means are we like psychiatrists or clinical psychologists, but there is a outside, psycho-emotional stress aspect that goes into performance in the gym, and being, your athlete's, friend or someone at least that they can trust in is, I think, incredibly useful, because then they can discuss those things with you, and then that can help you better, adjust programming if need be. Like if they're, not sleeping, if they just had a kid, if they just, went through a divorce, if, they just, lost a bunch of money, all these things, maybe if they're sick, all these different things can really affect one, their motivation to go to the gym, two, actually how they respond from that given stimulus, their compliance. Like there's just, again, everything is a multifactorial effect. And so having that initial buy-in and a trusting relationship, I think, will do you wonders as a coach in getting that athlete to perform their best in the long run.
Yeah, so if modern stress theory or stress science is telling us that like response is kind of like a biopsychosocial phenomenon where there's these psychological components, we need to be able to pay attention to those. Like your athlete, if you're working with your athlete online, then have ways to track that. Have ways, or at least an open line of communication where they can talk about it. If you're working with them in person, then just ask them how they're doing the day. Like, I think it really just comes down to, again, developing that relationship.
Yeah.
If you can't identify those problems, then it's just like, oh, the program's not working because it's a crappy program. It's like, well, yes, but not because of the specific variables, just because of like their internal environment at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you have anything else to add to this?
Honestly, I think that the key takeaways, because I mean that about wraps up. It's a very long paper, but the paper in general is discussing, previous stress theory compared to the stress theory that we have today, and some of the controversy between those two, and how it's evolved and how we can apply it to the training world. So it is very long and it's well written, but I think we've covered the key points fairly well. I think take home, again, going back to being a coach and developing a program, step one, I would say create a trusting relationship with your athlete. If you're the smartest human being in the world, but you have crap people skills or just don't care, it's going to be really hard to use your skills in an effective way. So, work on trusting relationships with your athletes. Two, develop, I'd say, a mutual plan. So talk to them and then also use your expertise to develop a plan. Realize that shit happens and your plan's probably going to need to be auto-regulated. And so be willing to change your plan based on life circumstances. Monitor the athlete, realize that they're a moving target throughout time. Use previous training history to do your best to see what's worked in the past and use that to help, gauge, what could potentially happen in the future. But then also, I would say, just really work on the individualization aspect of things and realize that, again, sometimes what looks good on paper doesn't actually work out all that well in the real life because of the other outside factors from the gym. So just be willing to change, be a good communicator, develop, trusting relationships. Do you have anything to add to that?
No, I would just like to end by reading my favorite quote from the paper, just because it kind of sums up everything you said, everything we've said. So John Kiely says, we need a structured training framework, yet one that is flexible and tolerant of change. We need goal-directed coherence, but simultaneously must facilitate seamlessly consistent course correction in response to dynamically emerging information. So adapt. Don't just plan these adaptations for your client or athlete, but adapt the program itself to them as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. This has been a Like Iron research review. I think it'd be cool to do like an actual podcast on this topic too, where we don't just talk about the paper, but also like, a system to do it.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks for listening.